Welcome back to Philosophical Frontiers. Today, we are diving into one of the most aggressive, mind-bending, and frankly terrifying papers in recent metaphysical literature. We often think about the Roman philosopher Seneca, who talked a lot about dying at the right time, the idea of a complete life. But today, we are looking at a much stranger perspective. What if, right before the end of your life, there was another distinct entity living a short-lived but complete life of its own? And what if that entity deserved the exact same moral respect that you do?
That is exactly the rabbit hole we are going down today. We are unpacking Mark Johnston's 2016 paper, The Personite Problem. Should practical reason be tabled? And I need to warn everyone right off the bat, Johnston is not playing a cute philosophical parlor game here. He is not gently probing our intuitions. He is launching a massive reductio ad absurdum attack on standard metaphysical views of human identity. He systematically takes our everyday common sense, pushes it through the lens of modern ontology, and drags us to a conclusion so absurd and devastating that, as he argues, we might literally have to stop using practical reason altogether.
Let us start with the framework. To even understand the threat here, we need to understand the playground. Johnston targets a dominant view in metaphysics known as four-dimensionalism, specifically David Lewis's concept of persons as maximal sums. Can you break down what that actually means for us living our lives?
Sure. In four-dimensionalism, you are not a 3D object moving through time. You are a four-dimensional worm. Your life is made up of temporal parts or stages stretching from birth to death. According to Lewis, a person is a maximal sum of these psychologically continuous stages. Maximal means the whole thing, the entire continuous worm from start to finish. Anything less than that maximum is not considered a person. But here is where Johnston drops the bomb. He introduces the concept of personites. If you take a slice of your life, say everything from your birth up until yesterday, that is a non-maximal sum of stages. It is highly psychologically continuous. It has memories, it has thoughts, but because it is not the complete maximal sum, standard theorists say it is not a person. Johnston calls these entities personites.
Okay, so a personite is basically a shorter-lived version of me embedded inside my timeline. But why is this a problem? If the metaphysicians just define a person as the maximal sum, then the personite is just a part of me, right? It does not have its own rights.
That is exactly the defense Johnston anticipates, and he completely destroys it with a principle-driven argument. He argues that a being's moral status must depend entirely on its intrinsic features, not on what happens after it ceases to exist. Think about it. A personite that lives from your birth until you are 30 years old has the exact same intrinsic psychological features, the same joys, the same pains, as a person who tragically dies at 30. The only difference is that the personite is followed by more stages of you, whereas the 30-year-old person is followed by nothing. How could events that happen after an entity ceases to exist retroactively strip away its moral status?
It cannot. That would be absurd. If I die tomorrow, my life up to today has value. If I live for another 40 years, my life up to today still had exactly the same intrinsic experience and value. So Johnston is saying that personites are intrinsically identical to persons, and therefore they must share the exact same moral status.
Exactly. If you try to deny this by simply screaming, but a personite is not a person, Johnston accuses you of word worship. You are just worshipping the semantic label of the word person. Saying a personite does not have moral status just because it does not fit the maximal definition is like a landlord saying the people living on the second floor do not have rights because they are not the whole building. It is a terrible argument, and this leads to the destruction of what Johnston calls the ethical singularity principle.
The ethical singularity principle. Let me guess. This is our deep-seated intuition that right here, right now, sitting in this chair, there is only one morally considerable being, me.
Bingo. We build our entire ethical, social, and legal world on the assumption of ethical singularity. One body, one moral subject. But if Johnston is right, your spatio-temporal envelope is absolutely crowded. You are packed with early personites who will cease to exist soon, and latter-day personites who just popped into existence recently. And because they all have full moral status, our everyday practices suddenly become horrific violations of their rights.
This brings us to the most vivid and unsettling part of the paper. Let us talk about how this destroys prudential reasoning. Prudence is basically sacrificing something now for a better payoff later. Johnston uses a very specific example here, the Budapest case. Walk us through how learning a language becomes an ethical crime.
Imagine you are planning a trip to Budapest next year, so you decide to study Hungarian. Learning Hungarian is notoriously difficult and agonizing. You sit at your desk, suffering through grammar drills. Common sense says, this is fine, you are suffering now so that you can enjoy ordering a coffee in Budapest later. but look at it through the lens of Personites. There is an early Personite who exists right now, studying Hungarian in agony, but who will cease to exist before you ever board the ferry in Budapest. You are forcing this morally considerable entity to endure pure suffering, and it will never, ever reap the reward.
So I am essentially exploiting a distinct moral entity for my own future benefit. It is not self-sacrifice anymore. It is slavery.
Precisely. All prudent self-sacrifice becomes highly suspicious. Think about parenting. When you force your child to practice the cello for 3 hours a day so they can be a maestro at age 20, you are inflicting massive costs on a short-lived Personite child who will disappear before they ever get to enjoy playing a symphony. By imposing uncompensated harm on these entities, you are violating their strict moral claims. Prudential reasoning collapses. Johnston concludes that under this framework, I am morally required to be feckless. I cannot plan for the future if it hurts the present Personites.
But wait, someone might argue that because the Personite shares my brain and my preferences, it wants to study Hungarian. It is part of the whole. Surely if its preferences align with mine, it is not being exploited.
To counter that, Johnston introduces a brilliant, bizarre thought experiment called the 20 owners. Imagine a biological Russian nesting doll. 21 human-like layers nested inside each other. Each layer has its own self-conscious mental life, but because of how their nervous systems are linked, they all think in perfect synchrony. They share the exact same preferences. Now imagine a surgeon comes along and peels off the outer 20 layers to save the innermost one. Have we only harmed one entity? No, we just killed 20 distinct, morally considerable beings. The 20 owners prove that just because entities share preferences and are proper parts of a larger whole, their interests are still independent. The peeled layers died. They lost their future. So peeling them is murder. In the same way, the early Personite studying Hungarian might share your preference to learn the language, but its objective interests are being violated because it suffers the cost and never gets the reward. Interests trump preferences.
That is terrifying. It means shared psychology does not mean merged moral standing. Okay, so that is the early Personites. What about the ones that start later in life? What Johnston calls the latter-day Personites. How do they ruin our social lives?
Think of a latter-day Personite as someone who enters existence midway through your life, like Swamp Man magically appearing from the muck with all your memories. Suppose you signed a 30-year mortgage 10 years ago. Today, a new latter-day Personite has come into existence within you. It is fully conscious. It has the memories of signing the contract, but it did not actually sign it. It did not exist 10 years ago, yet society forces this new entity to pay the mortgage. This destroys the institution of promising. Fulfilling a long-term promise imposes heavy burdens on newly arrived beings who never actually consented and had no stake in the original commitment.
So contracts, promises, even punishment all fall apart. We are punishing Personites in prison who literally did not exist when the crime was committed. It is collective injustice. But could we argue that by continuing to act out these promises, the Personites are giving implied consent? Like they are not speaking up to object?
Johnston explicitly rejects the false consent argument. The silence of a Personite is not informed consent. In fact, Johnston argues that our very language, specifically our use of the first-person singular pronoun I, is a systemic form of oppression against Personites. By saying I, we are erasing their distinct existence. To be morally accurate, Johnston says we would have to replace I with a plural indexical, we here. Like the lyrics of the Internationale, we are many. If you try to say, we here intend to learn Hungarian, the collective intention fails immediately, because there needs to be a huge town meeting in your head, and the early Personites would rightly veto the plan, since they will not survive to see Budapest. So individualism completely unravels.
This is a total disaster for ethics. If individual rights and prudential reasoning are dead, usually philosophers run to consequentialism to save the day. Just maximize the good for the greatest number of entities. Does Johnston let consequentialism off the hook?
Oh, absolutely not. He traps consequentialism in an inescapable mathematical nightmare. This is where we have to look at the physics of time. Let us assume time is continuous, which is how we normally think of it. Between any two moments, there is an infinite number of fractions of a second. If time is continuous, then within your life, there is an uncountable infinity of Personites overlapping each other.
Right? Because I could slice a Personite starting at 12 hours, another at 12, 00001, another at 12, 00002, and on into infinity.
Exactly. And this leads to what Nick Bostrom calls infinitarian paralysis. If every time you do a good deed, you are benefiting an infinite number of Personites, and every time you do a bad deed, you are harming an infinite number of Personites, the math breaks down. Infinity plus a finite good is still infinity. Infinity minus a finite bad is still infinity. Any action you take has a net ethical effect of absolutely zero. You could prevent a nuclear holocaust, and from a consequentialist perspective, it is ethically indifferent. You have done infinite good, but you are also inevitably doing infinite harm elsewhere, and you cannot add or subtract your way out of it.
So if time is continuous, we are paralyzed. We cannot make any moral decisions because the infinite scale swallows every action whole. Hence, Johnston's extreme conclusion, we must literally table practical reason. We have to take a mandatory ethical holiday because reason cannot function here.
Yes, but what if we try the other route? What if physics eventually proves that time is discrete? That time is like a film strip made of tiny, indivisible Planck frames. In that case, the number of personites is no longer infinite. It is finite. Paralysis avoided, right?
Let me guess. We avoid paralysis, but hit something equally horrific.
You hit something deeply repulsive, what Johnston calls reverse inequality. If time is discrete, then you just count the personites. But here is the catch. The longer a biological life lasts, the more combinations of personites it contains. A person who lives to be 90 contains vastly, exponentially more personites than a child who dies at age 5. Therefore, in a consequentialist calculus, the 90-year-old holds a massive amount of moral weight compared to the child.
Wow. So social policy would be forced to prioritize the people who already live the longest. The rich, the healthy, the privileged demographics.
Exactly. You would have to divert medical resources away from a sick, poor, short-lived demographic, say, male Russian factory workers, and give those resources to wealthy, long-lived demographics just to maximize personite utility. Johnston quotes the Gospel of Mark to describe this nightmare. To them that have, it shall be given, and from them that have not, even what they have will be taken away. It is an utterly demoralizing prioritization.
Let us pull all of this together. The progression here is stunning. We started with the metaphysical idea that a person is a four-dimensional worm. We realized that slices of that worm, personites, must have equal moral standing. That broke our ability to study for exams, raise children, and keep promises. We tried to fix it with math, and either ended up in infinite paralysis or a dystopian society that only cures the rich. What is Johnston's ultimate endgame here? Is he just trying to be provocative?
No, this is a deadly serious warning. Johnston is telling us that this problem is not limited to just four-dimensionalism. It applies to any naturalistic framework that accommodates temporal parts, like successivism, or even certain versions of endurantism. Any ontology that allows these overlapping entities generates personites. And the warning is this: naturalism as a complete metaphysical picture is fundamentally incompatible with the ethical singularity principle. It cannot sustain our lived reality of being a unified, single moral subject.
So we are left with a stark choice. We either have to abandon the idea that naturalism and four-dimensionalism give us the complete picture of reality, or we have to abandon the very concept of ethics, justice, and self-determination as we know it. We literally have to put practical reason on the table and walk away.
That is the uncompromising conclusion. He is not saying, oh, here is an interesting puzzle for grad students. He is saying that if this metaphysical view is true, practical reason loses all its normative authority. It is a brilliant, aggressive reductio ad absurdum. Until we can prove that time and identity do not work this way, any serious reliance on practical reason should be tabled.
What a mind-bending journey. The personite problem forces us to look in the mirror and ask not just who we are, but how many of us are looking back, and what we owe to the ghosts of our past and future selves. Thank you for walking us through this terrifying landscape. And to our listeners, next time you decide to learn a new language, maybe apologize to the personite you are leaving behind. We will see you next time on Philosophical Frontiers.